Happy New Year. Everybody else did that when they got up, so I thought I should too. What a wonderful story to have at the beginning of the year, isn't it? I would much prefer on this 8th day of Christmas, there's 4 more of them left, on this 8th day of Christmas to just dwell on the wise men. I like that story. It'll come up on the day of Epiphany, but the day of Epiphany is Friday, and so you're probably not going to be here unless you come to Friday Fellowship. And we won't have a worship service that day. So I'm going to talk about them now. Who were these wise men? And where did they come from? Matthew really doesn't tell us very much. In much of literature, after the Gospel of Matthew was written, some of it not very much after the Gospel of Matthew was written, there are all sorts of stories about these wise men that come from the East. We assume there were 3 of them because the 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But it doesn't say that. In fact, one particular writing from about the 4th century is called The Revelation of the Magi. And in this account, which is very interesting, it's written as if it were a first-person account of their travels from one of the wise men. But there are 12 of them, and they're called kings and sons of kings. And they bring with them an army. And the armies, about 12,000 troops, surround Jerusalem. No wonder Herod and all the people were panicked. In another one called the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, the wise men again are called kings. It comes from the western part of the early church, and they're named Melchior, Balthazar, Gaspar. And again, they're called kings. But Matthew doesn't tell us any of that. What he does tell us is that they come from a distant land, from the east. And they come searching for the king of the Judeans. And when Herod hears this, he's terribly troubled. Now, Herod was an interesting character. He was not Jewish. He was Idumean. He didn't have a right to be king. He was appointed king by the Romans. So when those wise men say, "We're looking for the one who is born King of the Jews," it's as if they're saying to Herod, "We're looking for the legitimate king, not you, or not one of your descendants." No wonder he's upset. And then, of course, they go find the child. We don't know how long after Jesus was born they find him. Probably not in that stable anymore. I would hope that they'd found a place to stay. And they do pay him homage. They don't worship him, really. They bow down before him, indicating respect and honor as one would do for a king. And then, of course, these ancient writings try to tell us what those gifts mean. That gold represents his kingship, that frankincense, his deity, myrrh, was an ointment used in burying the dead, represents his eventual death. All of this is wonderful stuff around the wise men. But then we get the rest of that story. I thought about titling the sermon, "The Empire Strikes Back," but thought I might be in violation of some copyright stuff. But when Herod learns that he's been tricked, because they return by another road, another route, by another way. I like that line. The wise men returned by another way, not Herod's way, by another way. It's interesting that early in the book of Acts, the people who are Christians are called followers of the way. And so these wise men, they choose another way to go back. And Herod's outraged at this. And so the report we get is that he had all the children killed that were 2 years old or under. The only place that we read about this in Matthew's gospel. And it would not have been out of character for Herod to do that. There's an ancient historian called Josephus. Josephus was a contemporary of Herod, Herod the Great. And he reports that Herod had killed 3 of his sons because there was a fear that they were going to remove him from power. And Herod instructed his soldiers that at the time of his death, that they were to go out and kill 1 person of every family in Judea so that there would be lots of mourning when he died. Toward the end of his life, he was a strange one. So it would not be out of character for Herod to order these children to be killed. I remember the first time I heard this when I was quite young. And I thought, how horrible. How could anyone do that? And I pictured in my mind hundreds and hundreds of children dying. Well, historians say it's more like 20 or so. It's a rural area. Most children died in childbirth. There probably weren't that many children there. Nevertheless, horrible. And I always thought in my mind, that's because of the time. That's because back then people were so violent. And they didn't care about children. They regarded children as nothing more than property. And then I started thinking, why did Herod tell us this? Why did Matthew tell us this? Why does he include this? And why in the world do the lectionary people want us to read this on Sunday morning? And I think it's because it represents the kind of world that Jesus came into. Hebrews reminds us that he suffered just like all the rest of us do. That he experienced all the temptations, that he experienced rejection, hatred even, threats, beatings, persecution. He experienced all of that in his life. He came into a world that was experiencing incredible violence. That's why he came. Because of that violence. Because people really weren't following the way. It occurred to me that perhaps we haven't changed much. This past December marked the 10th anniversary of the Sandy Hook school shooting that killed 20 children, 6 adults. Since that time, there have been 101 school shootings. 90 children have been killed. I remember when I first heard this story, they called it the slaughter of the innocents. We're told that the young man who was responsible for the Sandy Hook shooting was obsessed with video games and violent movies on TV. Have you been watching some of the shows on TV in the evenings? They're filled with violence, gun violence particularly. Since that shooting in Newtown, there have been 492 people killed in mass shootings in our country, not including other places. Slaughter of the innocents. For a long time, the manufacturers of these video games and even the movie industry maintained that it didn't have any effect on people. But for 30 years now, researchers have been taking a look at this exposure to violent media, and they've come to the conclusion that it does increase aggression. In a recent study published in Pediatrics, the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Brad J. Bushman and others describe the conclusions of researchers. For decades, researchers have studied the effects of exposure to violent media on aggression in children and youth. The evidence from those studies has been reviewed numerous times, and nearly all researchers have reached the same conclusion. Exposure to media violence can increase aggression. Those who say otherwise have simply not done their homework. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Psychological Association have all endorsed the following joint statement. The conclusion of the public health community, based on over 30 years of research, is that viewing entertainment violence can lead to increases in aggressive attitudes, values, and behavior, particularly in children. But it's popular. It seems to be the rage. It's getting worse all the time. And so I go back to that line of the wise men returning by another way. We're going to follow this Jesus now all the way to the cross. But in the process, he's going to show us another way. A way that unites us with a God who loves us so much that he's willing to die. A way that shows us that each individual in this world is precious in God's sight and deserves our love and our care, our compassion. That this is indeed a world where violence is nearly endemic, but it's also a place where Jesus leads those followers in ways that bring hope, peace, a word of love, and it makes a difference. It has an impact. I saw a television program by Steve Hartman called The Gift, and he highlighted people who did simple acts of kindness. Nothing monumental, nothing spectacular. But each of those acts spread. It was as if they exploded and impacted many, many lives. Jesus came as a solitary human being in a remote place called Bethlehem to a poor, unspectacular family and showed us that his act had the power to change the world. That in his death and resurrection, evil is destroyed. Evil is overcome. And we're part of that. So for this new year, When you consider watching television, maybe go another way. When you encounter those who seem to be evil, follow this one who shows another way. Spread this good news. It will make a difference. May you have a happy new year. May you go by another way. Amen.